It's my pleasure and privilege to deliver the concluding paper of this conference, which I hope you've enjoyed as much as we have. Wanda van Steen yesterday spoke about an early 19th century poet. Most of the rest of our speakers spoke about texts that are widely known and available, mainly from the 20th century. And I'm going to bring you to the other end, from the early 19th century to what is practically now, or even the future, because as Antoni said, the text I'm going to speak about hasn't been published yet, it hasn't been performed in its entirety yet. The play I'm talking about is Marios Pontikas' Neiing, Eumenides. Its first part was performed in 2007, but not the play in its entirety. And as I said, the play is actually in press. Now then, as everyone in this room will know, I'm sure, Marios Pontikas is a playwright, a screenwriter, who, interestingly, is among a handful of authors whose work neatly falls into two distinct periods. Periodization is usually a very controversial affair, but in the case of Marios Pontikas, it's relatively unambiguous and uncontroversial. There is an earlier, longer period from his first play, The Panoramic View of a Night Job. Panoramic View of a Night Job, published and performed in 1970, down to Watch Them, performed in 1990. By the way, I hope everyone has a handout before them. The printed handout you have is exactly the same as the one on the screen. During that first period of Pontikas' dramatic writing, his work focuses consistently on a distinct and rather circumscribed set of themes and attitudes, namely the life of large, if invisible, swathes of petit bourgeois Greeks, or even of the Greek lumpen proletariat. It is the pathology of those social classes that Pontikas dissects mercilessly and often satirically. I'm speaking, of course, of a very dark satire. Now, in 1990 comes a break. After Pontikas' play Watch Them, he falls silent, theatrically silent, that is. In 2001, in an interview to the Sunday edition of the Eleftherotypia, Pontikas said that his silence was the outcome of the collapse of the social and political certitudes that had informed his and his colleagues' earlier dramatic output. And I'm reading item number 2 in your handout. At the time, that is in the 1970s and 80s, we were sociologists. We had all the answers, the right way. It was a time when the leftist movements promised a future. We were also a bit didactic. You could write a denunciatory play. Now we're experiencing total confusion. We are struggling to understand this impending unknown, and mark my words, this is what will produce great plays. The best texts are the product of confusion. One thing's for sure, the certitudes of the 1960s are no longer valid. Even the ideological tools have become unreliable after a point. I have experienced this void. Pontikas' long silence came to an end in 2004, when he resumed writing for the theatre and produced The Murderer of Laius and the Provost, a play that explicitly engages with the Oedipus myth, although from a violently revisionist angle. If in his earlier output Ponticus had dissected the pathology of the lower social strata in contemporary Greece, in The Murder of Laius he turns to the pathology of human logos instead. Logos in the sense both of innate intellect and of articulate speech. I'm not going to be looking at The Murder of Laius in any detail today, but let me tell you this much. The Murder of Laius falls into two parts. In the first part, a befuddled, anonymous peasant gradually realizes, or perhaps admits, what he had suspected all along, namely that he may be a modern incarnation of Oedipus, that he may have shot his father dead, that he may have married his mother, and that he may have confronted the Sphinx and, as it turns out, suffered defeat at her hands, as it were, rather than defeating her as his mythical forebear have done. In the second part of The Murder of Laius, a crow woman, a fantastic figure that is in many ways homologous to the mythic Sphinx, announces the imminent arrival of a dismal future in which human language will give way to the inarticulate calls of crows. Human language, the crow woman proclaims, is an arbitrary construct, which is ultimately incapable of producing meaning. It is merely a system of arbitrary signs which fail to reveal anything about reality and which merely go on to defer meaning ad infinitum. In this respect, human language is inferior even to the elemental noises of crows, which at least have the advantage of not pretending to be meaningful. This fundamental mistrust in the effectiveness of human speech, this despair about the ability of human speech to communicate meaning, seems to be part and parcel of Ponticus's growing mistrust towards the stylized or even fossilized dialogue techniques of conventional theater. Here's an excerpt from a 2001 interview. That's item 3 in your handout. An interview to the Eleftheria newspaper. If speech on the stage, that is, were to be limited even further, I would be delighted. I find this classic manner extremely irritating. I talk, you talk, they reply, I talk, you talk, they talk. This never happens in real life. This stylization is our doing, and I find it tiresome. I would like to break free from the fetters of speech, something I see happening in a good number of performances. Of course, it isn't all that simple. It can't simply, I can't simply abolish speech by replacing it with movement or with sounds. Theater is speech too, but it can't be just speech. So it's both as a thinker and as a theater craftsman that Ponticus is mistrustful towards human speech, and this pessimistic attitude towards human speech in The Murder of Laius turns into something much more pervasive and fundamental in the play I want to look at today with you, and I mean Neighing, Climindrisma, which is, as I said at the beginning, Ponticus's latest play, only partly performed and still unpublished. There's more information in item 4 in your handout about this play. In Neighing, it is humanity itself that's violently rejected and treated with undisguised contempt. The human condition is subjected to incessant derision, to scornful disparagement, especially by the place's chorus of 3 Erinyes, the 3 ancient Erinyes, Megaira, Alicto, and Tisiphone. What I wish to focus on in this paper is the way in which Ponticus's name engages with Greek tragic myth in order to deconstruct it. I keep getting this feeling that in name, Ponticus wants to shout, enough with the Greeks, down with antiquity. We've had enough of those incessant humanist readings of the classical tradition and so on. So what I think Ponticus is doing in name is trying to deconstruct conventional readings of Greek myth as a fundamental component of post-Renaissance, post-Enlightenment, Western humanism. I wish to argue that in name, classical antiquity is not invoked as a quasi-transcendental authority from which the contemporary work supposedly draws some sort of legitimization. In naming, classical antiquity does not validate, classical antiquity does not ratify. Rather, Ponticus's engagement with ancient Greek texts provides the starting point and the means for a dangerous and often subversive reflection and self-reflection. Ponticus achieves this not least by experimenting with the aesthetics of post-dramatic theatre. So there's a rather novel fusion here, novel at least as far as modern Greek theatre is concerned, between the aesthetics of post-dramatic theatre on the one hand and the engagement and the dialogue with ancient Greek tragedy. What sort of post-dramatic elements do I see in neighing? Space is one of them. Neighing is set in a space that explicitly defies the attributes of conventional stage space. Space in neighing breaks free from the aesthetics, the conventional aesthetics of Maenitic representation. It has no solid identity. It does not offer any recognizable configurations. It is populated, or rather haunted, by phantasmatic, unreal figures. There is a mutilated Chiron, only his human torso is visible, a crawling torso. His horse half has run away in disgust. There is a half-delirious Cassandra, and there is a chorus, as I said before, of perpetually sneering Irenaeus. The play's space is literally utopic. It is explicitly described in the introductory stage direction as an utopos, a non-place. It resembles Hades, but is not Hades. It is populated by living people who are nonetheless dead. It looks vaguely familiar, but is like nothing you've ever seen before. The very first words of the play, uttered by the centaur, Chiron, introduces abruptly to this disturbing, destabilizing coincidence of opposites. And I want you to look at item 5A in your handout. The centaur Chiron speaks, the very first words of the play, somewhere around here, there, and everywhere, light from somewhere, and darkness, dark light, luminous darkness, a sunless sun, darkness shining on the sun, which shines on the earth, something like that. Now, this rather obviously harks back to Sophocles' Ajax. O darkness, my light, O gloom, most luminous in my eyes. But of course, this coincidentia oppositorum, this coexistence of opposites in a state of perennial flux, is very much a Heraclitean idea. And I think there can be no doubt that Ponticus is here deliberately appropriating Heraclitus, because his centaur actually was Heraclitus. That's handout item 5C. The way up and the way down are one and the same. So the paradoxical, the fluid nature of the landscape in which neighing is enacted is described most explicitly by the centaur in your handout, item 6A. Nor are persons what that word signifies, nor are they phantoms. The Greek word used by Ponticus is idola, which I think is meant to recall idola kamonton. Also, they are not shadows. Still, you can recognize him, her, the next one, as though you're alive, as though they're alive, as though they're alive and they're dead but alive, something like that. Nor are they dead, living dead, something like this. You might put it this way: you're already dead while still alive. You don't know, you wouldn't swear by it, you're alive, but you don't know that you're dead. It's complicated. You're dead and you don't know that you're alive. The idea that life and death interpenetrate and coexist is once again derived, I think, ultimately from Heraclitus, and that's 6b in your handout: athanati, thniti, athanati, and so on. Immortals are mortal, mortals immortal, living the other's death, dead in the other's lives. So you don't know where you are in here, you don't know whether you're dead or alive. If it's the centaur, Chiron, that opens the play is subsequently invaded by the figure of Cassandra. And when Cassandra enters the play space, we are confronted with the prophetess struggling to express the inexpressible and to utter the unutterable. Her speech is manifestly ecstatic. It is extravagantly disjointed. She delivers a delirious monologue that verges on the edge of the abyss of non-language. Just as her Aeschylean forebear, the Aeschylean Cassandra in Agamemnon, had broken out of her long silence with a resounding, inarticulate cry, "Oto toto toi popoita." The first words we hear from Aeschylus' Cassandra are inarticulate cries. Typically an agent of authoritative speech, Cassandra the prophetess is now reduced almost to inarticulacy. Ultimately, Ponticus' Cassandra, like Aeschylus' Cassandra, will come to renounce her prophetic gift by trampling and spitting on hemantic insignia, just as her Aeschylean forebear had done in Agamemnon. And I'd like you to look at your handout number 7a, Cassandra speaking. "How am I now to utter the unutterable? Hapless that I am. In what unfound words am I to put it? Should I say fetuses will devour fetuses in battlefield wombs, in laboratory wombs, should I say? Why then am I wearing these scepters and these mantic wreaths for people to laugh at me? Get lost, you, down with you, that's what you deserve. I trample on you, spit on you in anger and contempt. I don't want your words, Apollo. Let an inarticulate speech be heard." "The words you gave me are a trap. I don't need them and I despise them. Let an inarticulate, unutterable speech be heard then. Terrible reminiscence of mine, voice of a swallow. Don't let yourself be heard. Don't take my voice. I'd rather have my tongue twisted 1,000 times and untwisted 1,000 more, and crawl and keep crawling until it breathes its last, if ever in words I speak again. I, man Cassandra." Ego Andras Cassandra is the Greek text with an obvious wordplay. As if to point to her literary origins in the Aeschylean Cassandra, Ponticus' Cassandra incorporates snippets of her ancient forerunner's discourse, and Ponticus himself italicizes the parts that he wants us to know he's borrowed from Aeschylus. Why then, it's at the top of page 3, why then am I wearing these scepters in these mantic wreaths for people to laugh at, and so on. That's a quotation in translation, in Bible Greek translation of lines 1264 to 5 from Agamemnon, and that's item 7b. Why then do I bear these mockeries of myself, this one, these prophetic chaplets of my neck? And a little further below, it's underlined on your handout, item 7a, that's the fifth line from the top of the page, terrible reminiscence of mine, voice of a swallow, and so on. This is indeed a reminiscence, a remembrance. This is a reminiscence of Clytemnestra's comment on Cassandra's long silence in Aeschylus' Agamemnon. That's item 7c in your handout. Well, if your language is not strange and foreign even as a swallow's, let her speak, is a continuation. In the climax of her monologue, Ponticus's Cassandra comes full circle back to her Aeschylean origins by adopting, often verbatim, the Aeschylean Cassandra's delirious cries as she is being invaded by Apollo's prophesying ecstasy, and as her power of speech is being shattered or reduced to half-articulate utterances. That's item 8a in your handout from Ponticus's name. You dead ones take the trouble to guess. A birth of horrendous sounds is in the works. You, kaka, pape, io, topire, perchete, la, 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 la. And that's an exact quotation from Aeschylus' Agamemnon, item 8b. You, oh, kaka, pape, and so on. Ah, oh, the agony, oh, what fire it comes upon me. Woe, woe, Lycian Apollo, Ami, Ami. I've dwelt on the first part of the stage triptych that is named, because I find that the first part of the play encapsulates most of the play's central concerns. The negation of articulate speech, the shattering of articulate speech under the burden of the unutterable logos of prophecy. Also, in tune with the aesthetics of post-dramatic theatre, the invasion of rational space by the incoherent, by the inarticulate, by the fragmentary, and by the paradoxical. In short, by the eclipse of all the certitudes that make up our complacent, self-congratulatory perception of ourselves as the rational crown of creation. It is this perception that is undermined in the play's second part, which is entitled Centaur Chiron Abasement. In this second part, the post-dramatic aesthetics of fragmentation take on a grotesquely literal aspect, a visual aspect, because we see a literally fragmented Centaur Chiron crawling on stage. We actually see only his human torso, his human upper half, because his lower half, his horse half, has run away, leaving his human torso behind as a sorry remnant of his former fullness. Adding insult to injury, the Greek chorus of Eumenides offers sarcastic comments. An outstanding humanist once, a passionate ideologue, they say, Chiron used to embody a Promethean. Promethean means self-admiring. Promethean means misguidedly triumphant belief in Enlightenment-style human progress. Now, however, Chiron's mutilated body, a sad remnant in a crimson stain that spreads and congeals slowly without congealing, is a palpable sign of the pathology of human logocentrism. Resisting Chiron's pleas for mercy, the Eumenides continues sardonically to compare the Centaur with Prometheus. That so-called, I quote, that so-called benefactor of humanity, that industrialist of hopes. However, as the Eumenides go on to remark, even Prometheus had to admit in the end that his principal achievement consisted in causing blind hopes to dwell in the breasts of people. That's item 9A in your handout. Alicto, one of the Iranians, says, that so-called benefactor of humanity, the renowned Prometheus, the industrialist of hopes, when he was still fettered on a rock in the middle of bloody nowhere, in the back of beyond, and an eagle was feasting on his liver, and his liver grew back, blind hopes did I plant in men, the industrialist suddenly shouts. Blind, which is to say that no hope can see its future, only its own promises, nothing more, can't see beyond its nose. It's bad blind, can't see. This is obviously a transparent allusion to Prometheus bound, item 9b, where Prometheus says, yes, I caused mortals to cease foreseeing their doom. Chorus, of what sort was the cure that you found for this affliction? Prometheus, I caused blind hopes to dwell within their breasts. A great benefit was this you gave to mortals, replied Chorus. Let me now move on to a few remarks by way of an epilogue. I'll leave aside the third part of Nei, which is in any case an extremely short one. Greek tragedy, we've witnessed that during this conference. Greek tragedy and Greek tragic myth have been repeatedly used since antiquity and down to the present day as legitimizing devices. Authors, playwrights, theatre people, especially those comfortably ensconced in post-Renaissance or post-Enlightenment traditions, have time and again turned to Greek tragic myth with a view to enlisting its authority in order to bolster the validity of their own politics, in the broadest sense of the term, and to legitimate their own claims to canonicity. Greek myth and Greek tragic myth is a universally accessible medium, and as such it can relatively easily be employed as a tool for the interpretation of history and of individual or collective reactions to it. And it can, as this kind of tool, it can impose a certain shape on chaos, and it can offer the comfort of an underlying structure behind what appears as disorder and chaos and unpredictability. In that way, the authority of ancient myth can easily be turned into a hegemonic tool. Why? Because it can be used to predetermine the actualization of the meaning of a modern work at the point of reception as a structure based on specific ordering principles, as a structure based on an often implicit set of underlying self-legitimizing assumptions. What Ponticus does in Neighing is to resist and even to challenge this politics of appropriation. If he resorts to, or if he enlists the intertextual medium of Greek tragedy, it is in order to subvert it, down with the Greeks, as I said. Or at least in order to subvert the specious, if time-honored usurpation of Greek tragedy and tragic myth as a foundation of Western-style humanism, that hoary mantra which discussions of classical antiquity so often fall back to, and which has become so vague as to be essentially meaningless. By violently questioning logocentrism, by ceaselessly lampooning the self-perpetuating, vapid and stereotyped humanist approaches to antiquity, Ponticus launches a frontal assault against the deep-rooted Western attitude and tradition. If his deconstructionist enterprise appears nihilistic, if it appears cynical, it may well be both, but it has at least the advantage of shaking us out of our smug certainties and lazy assumptions. Thank you very much for your attention.